Well, it is 3:50 p.m., so we will get started with our next session. My name is Courtney McAllister. I'm one of the co-chairs of the NASIG Autumn Virtual Conference Committee, and I'm so excited to welcome you back for more excellent content. And I am happy to turn it over to our next set of presenters, Snowden, Rochelle, and Dib. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and thanks to all of you. I'm Snowden Becker. I am the community manager for the LOCKSS program at Stanford Libraries. I'm joined by my colleagues, Rochelle and Tim. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I can go ahead. Hi, I'm Rochelle Lundy. I'm the director of the Office of Scholarly Communications at Stanford University.
And my name is Tib Gishak. I'm the program manager of the LOCKSS program at Stanford Libraries.
Fabulous. And we are here today to talk about the past, present, and future of the Global LOCKSS Network, which is the flagship network of the LOCKSS program and the LOCKSS software. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction and a historical overview of what LOCKSS is and where it came from. We were inspired, our founders were inspired by the first digital revolution in scholarly publishing, which was the transition from paper-based publications to e-journals and books and online distribution and publication platforms, where our founder, Vicky Reich, and her colleague, David Rosenthal, understood that with the tremendous increase in capacity and potential with digital publishing, there also came a loss in critical affordances, where previously a subscription to a scholarly journal got you a paper copy of each new issue that you could sit on the shelf, and your readers and researchers could have permanent access to an authentic and equivalent copy to every other librarian and publisher or every other subscriber. The digital access subscriptions would grant you only access to a file that lived on a publisher's platform. That was a removal of local ownership and a shift to remote access. Those formats were also ephemeral in the early days of the 90s in digital publishing. There was a lot of concern about websites being hacked or not being accessible 24/7. The web wasn't seen as reliable as it is today. And so the LOCKSS software and the idea of lots of copies keeping stuff safe became not just a slogan and a fundamental principle of digital preservation, but an open source software platform and a network of libraries that we now call the Global LOCKSS Network, that were united by the use of an open source software platform called LOCKSS. The Global LOCKSS Network is a consortium of over 80 libraries and research centers worldwide. And being a member of this network gives participating libraries a virtual digital shelf for their subscribed and open access resources, where a server, or LOCKSS box as we call it, connects to the web to collect and cache content that libraries subscribe to. It performs automatic error checking and correction with a peer-to-peer protocol. So each node in the network, or each box, is talking to the others to perform automatic error checking and correction. And that local copy can be available to users on site for failover, post-disappearance, and post-cancellation access. So if you stop subscribing to a journal, the copies and issues that you previously had access to can remain locally stored and available for the future without your researchers having to pay a per article charge to retrieve it from the publisher's website. And that leads us into a second digital revolution in scholarly publishing, which is happening now with transformation of those digital publishing platforms, and the very process of scholarly communication in general is being rewritten. So just as the LOCKSS program and Stanford Libraries were on the front edge of that transformation with the development of the LOCKSS program and the Global LOCKSS Network, we are now looking at the present and the future as an opportunity to continue to innovate and bring community-based solutions to the technical challenges of the scholarly communications world. And with that, I'll pass it off to Rochelle.
Great, thanks. So one of the key changes we've seen with this second digital transformation in scholarly publishing is that we've seen open access, which Soden mentioned was one of the factors that influenced the initial creation of the LOCKSS network. Open access has gone from being merely an option for scholarly publishing to really becoming the predominant model of how we publish scholarly articles with this new transformation. So an article that's published today is actually more likely to be available open access than not. At Stanford University, where we are, we've actually found that nearly 70% of the articles that have been authored by people at Stanford within the past 5 years are available in some form of open access. In part, that's because the benefits of open access have become very well established during this time, both the obvious equitable benefits to readers, but we've also been able to obtain better evidence for the impact and visibility that open access creates for authors. And funders have reinforced this by requiring open access on an increasing basis for the work that they fund. So in Europe, we've seen the emergence of Plan S and a consensus among government funders there that open access should be the way their researchers are sharing what they produce. In the United States, we've recently seen our federal government announce that it is going to be both strengthening and expanding its requirements for public access to research over the next few years through what's been called the Nelson Memo or the OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy Memorandum. But this growth of open has also created a lot of costs, as I'm sure many of the people in this audience who work in libraries know. The open access model has become heavily monetized by commercial publishers, and nearly all commercial publishers now have fairly large open access journal portfolios that they are relying on for revenue. And so this has resulted in huge amounts of money being spent by authors and their institutions and their funders. One recent study found that the amount of money that's been transferred to publishers globally over the past 4 years in article processing charges for open access publishing is upwards of $1 billion. At Stanford, even using fairly conservative numbers for the amount that we publish and the amount we think is probably about average for our researchers' open access fees, we estimate that nearly $8 million each year is being transferred to publishers in the form of these fees for articles coming out of our institution. So a lot of money is now being spent on this open access model. And so if we go ahead to the next slide, in parallel to this growth of open access, we've also seen interest in not just making publications or the final results of research openly available, but an interest in really opening up the entire research process and in researchers sharing artifacts that are not just those final results, but the data they produce, codes, protocols, methods. Yeah, if we go back, thanks.
Sorry.
You never know with slides. So in sharing all of these other artifacts that form part of the research process, that's been in part because this also creates the same equitable and inclusivity benefits we see with open access to publications, but it's also really become a way of promoting research integrity and improving research reproducibility through the transparency that this provides into how research is created and what researchers are doing to get to those final results. Again, like open access, we've seen this interest being reinforced by funders who want to maximize the visibility and impact of the work that they're supporting. And so this has created a major expansion in the types of scholarly outputs that are made available and that are considered valuable and important to people who are participating in the research enterprise. And so at the intersection of these two trends, open access to publications and this expansion of the scholarly record to include artifacts that are produced throughout the research process are preprints, or the practice of distributing results or analysis prior to them being formally published or undergoing peer review. So if we flip ahead one slide, there we go. So preprints are article manuscripts that are distributed prior to undergoing any form of peer review, sometimes simultaneously with the submission to a journal, but sometimes before any submission to a journal has occurred or is even being considered by researchers. Researchers really appreciate the fact that this creates visibility and impact for their work. without them having to wait to go through the formal publication process. It broadens the range of peers from which they can receive feedback and accelerates the timeline on which they can see others' research, they can act on it, incorporate it into their own research, and they can receive feedback from others, again, enhancing this reproducibility and integrity of the research process by providing early exposure for errors or things that may need to be corrected. And one of the things that's been most noted about preprints is that because they are shared before there is any publisher involvement with the manuscript or any publisher work being done on a manuscript, they provide a route to open access that can happen without a publisher imposing an article processing charge or imposing restrictions on when and how a manuscript can be shared by the researcher. So if we go one more, so preprints have really grown exponentially over the past decade, both in terms of how many preprints we see being shared and being made available, but also in terms of their role and reputation within scholarly research. So we see more and more preprints that are cited in published articles. We see them cited and relied upon in grant applications. And in fact, we started to see many funders formally encouraging their researchers to share their work in the form of preprints. The NIH, which I've linked to here, has provided formal guidance to researchers on preprint sharing, and other funders like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute have also issued this kind of guidance saying, please share your research as preprints. We think that it's valuable. And just in the past year, we've seen the largest private funder in the United States, which is the Gates Foundation, introduce a new policy that is going to actually mandate preprint sharing for everyone that they fund. So beginning in 2025, the Gates Foundation is going to require all of its grantees to share their work in the form of preprints. It's correspondingly no longer going to be paying open access fee article processing charges to publishers. So they're really looking to create a shift in how we accomplish access by mandating preprint sharing. And they themselves have actually introduced a platform for preprint sharing. So we've seen this large growth in the use of preprints, in the embrace of preprints across the scholarly community, but this has all really happened without any clear consensus on what are the best practices for preprint sharing, what are the standards for linking preprints to other parts of the scholarly record. These are all discussions that are only beginning to happen and issues that are only beginning to really be decided and agreed upon across the scholarly community. And we're also seeing that preprints, because this growth has happened in this organic fashion, being shared on a wide variety of platforms. So we've seen dedicated preprint servers, some of which are discipline specific, some of which are very general and accept research from any discipline. We see preprints popping up in institutional repositories. We see it in our own institutional repository at Stanford. And we also see them being shared in just almost any other place. People are sharing scholarly work. So even on data repositories, platforms like that, and publishers are getting into this game as well by developing their own systems for preprint sharing that are integrated with their submission and publishing workflows. So we see preprints in all of these different platforms, in all of these different places, and really without any clear guidance yet as to how people should be sharing these in the best possible way. So this presents some significant challenges for thinking about how do we ensure the long-term viability of these documents that we now see as really important artifacts in the research enterprise. So I'm going to pass it on to Tib to talk a little bit more about our thinking along those lines.
Thanks, Rochelle. I want to take a moment to talk about the challenges of preserving the scholarly web. The LOCKSS software that is the underpinning of the Global LOCKSS network can be used to preserve communally in a decentralized manner any type of data or resource. But the Global LOCKSS network is inherently a web archiving endeavor. It started at the turn of the century, and it was already recognized at the time that researchers of the day and researchers of the future will think of the medium, the natural habitat of the scholarly record as it was moving online, as the web pages that you interact with in browsers. And so it was thought to be necessary to do a web archiving effort where the object is not just the words of the author, but also sort of the web environment in which it lives. And web preservation is difficult. It was already quite difficult when I joined the field early in the aughts, and it is only becoming more difficult over time. We started out with a static web of documents. And now, of course, nothing is static anymore. Everything is dynamic. PDFs are no longer necessarily static either. Every time you download a PDF of an article, it has your name and your date and your IP address on it. We are now seeing PowerPoint slides are stamped every time and are right. And so even preserving the same artifact of research between different libraries, they are not preserving the same object. No one has the ability to download the very same object, even for things that are thought to be static, like images, PDFs, and PowerPoint slides. We went from server-side rendering, meaning that you ask for a web page, it assembles HTML on, at the publisher's site and then serves it to your browser, and your browser displays it. Now there are many JavaScript and other dynamic frameworks where the ingredients for the page and the recipe are served to your browser, and your browser assembles this by fetching additional bits and pieces from all over the place. And this makes it very difficult to discover programmatically things and to download all those pieces that might be in the web page. Of course, websites are very different than layout in print publishing, which tends to be, it doesn't change very often on the web. Some publisher sites are tweaking their visuals literally every day. And it's funny because when we tell them that, they say, oh, no, we don't do that. We don't spend our time tweaking the pages, but it's that we have incontrovertible evidence that they do. And that makes it difficult, again, to compare copies that are made in multiple places against each other. The web infrastructure is being fragmented at the moment. It used to be that you had your website and it came with your fonts and your JavaScript and your everything that you might need to render your site. Nowadays, the fonts come from somewhere, the icons come from someplace else. The JavaScript is served from Google or from jQuery.com. And so that now relies on these third parties to also be around in the future for web preservation to succeed. And of course, the biggest challenge in the scholarly web is that the web is a single point of origin. So if it disappears from one place, it is no longer accessible for anyone. Is it authentic? All it takes is for the one copy upstream to be modified by a hacker for it to no longer be authentic. And censorship, right? Like it only takes one place to be censored in order to remove access to some piece of literature that might be undesirable. Next slide, please. So scholarly publications in particular has its own challenges. Figures, slides, audio, video, computer code, data sets might now be served from all sorts of places, not centralized at the journal website. They may be from Figshare and SlideShare and a video provider, and the computer code is from CodeOcean, whatever, right? So now even to do web preservation, you need to interact with many different actors, not just one publisher. And it turns out with 20 years experience, we can see that publishers love to change publishing platforms every few years. So that makes all the URLs change. The DOIs might resolve to all new places and so forth, even for content that's been published already. Preprints specifically have yet other challenges that are associated with them. There may not be a connection to an eventual publication, supposing that the preprint becomes a peer-reviewed publication. There are unique affordances that are really the promise of preprints, like commenting and annotations, and those are no longer easy to preserve because they are so fleeting and they evolve over time. Social media and other fleeting engagement of the scientific community and the research community is becoming increasingly important, but it's very difficult to preserve these sort of platform-specific and walled garden sort of environments of communication. Emulation, format migration, authentic replication are issues for preprints as much as other scholarly web elements. And of course, preprint servers have a tendency to be less website-like and more repository-like. So now we're interacting with piles of documents, and they're all there, but they're not necessarily in a browsable format, or they don't necessarily look like a print publication or a website publication. So all of these challenges make preprint preservation very difficult. I'll pass it back to Snowden, I believe.
Yeah, so this I think we've conveyed adequately the sense that we are in a moment that replicates a lot of the original challenges that brought the LOCKSS software, the LOCKSS program, and LOCKSS networks into existence. And we're facing some of those challenges with the same spirit that we created LOCKSS with. That is first this idea that if it's worth publishing, it's worth preserving, and that libraries have an active role to play in that preservation process. And the word "if" is playing a big, doing some heavy lifting here in this quote from a recent article by Oya Rieger, which is that if preprints are first-class research objects and not simply drafts or throwaway scholarship, then they do merit more serious consideration for preservation. And that if is being less and less challenged, as Rochelle noted. Preprints and the preprint to publication pipeline is becoming more and more commonly a pathway to sharing scholarly outputs. So let's say if yes, they are first-class research objects, what are the historical lessons that we can learn forward here? Well, first and foremost, we have discovered not just through anecdotal senses, but through hard data and concerted scholarship, including Martin Paul Eves' recent publication in librarianship and scholarly communication, that a far smaller number of publishers are preserving a far smaller percentage of their serials publications than we even imagined. That this is publication is the mode of business, preservation is the afterthought. And Tib, you can point to some additional statistics here that are even scarier to show us that this is not a lesson we have learned yet, that the preservation figures are sobering.
Yeah, so I'll add just very briefly to these statistics from this particular paper. The paper also says that 33% of Crossref members don't preserve their content in any recognized archive, like, for example, the Global LOCKSS Network. There are other scholarly archives like LOCKSS and others. 58% only preserve their content in one archive, 8.5% in two, and less than 1% in three. And the ISSN International Center also maintains statistics on online resources. They say that 76% of online resources that they track are not preserved in any keeper's archive. Again, the Global LOCKSS Network is a keeper's archive, and CLOCKSS is also, and there are others. 19% of online resources they track are preserved in just one or two of these keepers' archives, and less than 6% are preserved in three or more. So the scholarly record of the peer-reviewed, so the more traditional type that you might think as the scholarly record outside of preprints, is already, a quarter of a century into the 21st century, still poorly preserved, and preprints are just in an even worse state of preservation.
Yes, and that's with services like CLOCKSS, LOCKSS, the GLN, Portico, the Internet Archive, many groups and options for responsible publications and preservations. And as many of you may be aware, Internet Archive had a major outage this week. The idea that putting it in one repository is sufficient or a guarantee of longevity is increasingly being tested. So the question is, are we learning the lessons of history, or are we looking at the possibility that we're going to repeat them? Right now, we are talking and thinking about this because it seems that the preprint servers are perhaps about to repeat those same lessons that we have seen some scholarship emerging. We have a bibliography on Zotero that I'm happy to invite people to about preprints preservation specifically. There has been a survey of preprints, but they are highly reliant on things like the OSF repository, and those are commitments to accessibility, but not necessarily authentic replication or preservation of the data. And as Tib explained, those are different things. Making a copy and replicating the publication environment are two different things entirely. And we are really concerned with authentic preservation and the replication of the data. So it's not just the author's words, but the full scope and nuance of the publication as it was presented. So here's what we're doing about it. Obviously, we're talking about it internally. We are chicken littling and saying, "Hey, this is a little scary. Is anybody doing anything about this? Let's do some research and see if there's a lifeboat being launched." We're talking about it externally here with our colleagues and the same communities that helped us derive a technical solution for a community-based problem in the past. And we're recruiting expert input from the field. We are talking to all of you in part because you are on the front lines of this battle and best equipped to tell us the challenges you're experiencing and the future that you see. We are conducting additional presentations and discussions with stakeholders like publishers at the Society of Scholarly Publishing. We are reaching out to folks who have traditionally been funders and supporters of preprints, the National Science Foundation, the collection development community, and others who have a stake in this. We are going to be holding a mini symposium, an exploratory discussion group at the Coalition for Networked Information member meeting in DC in December. If anyone is interested in participating, we're going to have a link for you to connect with us and potentially take part in that. And that really is going to be a more focused discussion at which we are going to define the scope of the problem and try to enumerate the impact of inaction. What happens if we don't do anything about this? We anticipate that this will probably lead to a grant application or an appeal for funding to support a working group, a pilot project, and or a larger summit meeting. And we want to leverage the structures and systems that are already in place, namely the Global LOCKSS Network, which is a community of librarians and professionals that are already demonstrably invested in and committed to preservation of the scholarly record. So that leads us to what you can do. If you're in this session, you might have an interest in helping us move forward. We certainly hope so. First and foremost, you can make this an active Q&A session. We would love to hear your questions, comments, and experiences. Please fill up the chat, raise your virtual hand, and let us know if this is something that you also have been thinking about, or if you at your institution are a preprint producer or preserver, and what challenges you're encountering that might be helped with solutions that come from a community or have community support. You can reach out to email any of us. And of course, we have a list which you can join for updates. And we will be sharing everything that we have, including that bibliography of running resources and plans for upcoming events and presentations. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up to our audience. Thank you for your patience and please lay it on us. What questions do you have for us?
First of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I feel one of the drawbacks of virtual is you don't get the applause at the end, but thank you so much for a very insightful and informative presentation. As our attendees are thinking through their questions, I wanted to just share two quick things. One is that folks have been sharing resources in the chat, which is great. So if people are catching up, there are a few links there. NASIG has a digital preservation model policy that has been linked to the chat as well, in case anyone's interested. And my kind of initial question, this is so great. I feel like digital preservation often gets bundled into this category of things people care about when it breaks. Like it has to go wrong for people to pay attention, which is really like horrible to think about. But do you have any just kind of advice if those of us in the audience are having conversations with decision makers or administrators? Maybe we don't have decision making authority, but we want to kind of emphasize the impact here. Do you have any kind of advice for us in those conversations to get people to kind of initially at least care a little more?
Rochelle, I'm gonna bat it to you because I expect this is something that you are already engaged in yourself.
Well, I think that one of the most effective things, at least for those of us who work in academic libraries, which I imagine is the majority of people who are here today, is that I certainly find that faculty voices and researcher voices tend to go a lot farther with administrators often than our own do. And I have found that many faculty are really interested in speaking out on this topic and in being willing to put their voice forward for issues that matter to them in scholarly communication. And in particular on this issue of, well, preservation generally, but of preprints in particular, I've spoken with many researchers at Stanford over the past few years who told me that preprints are really, for some disciplines, are almost the most important part of their publishing process these days. In many disciplines, it's an integral part. In some disciplines, this is really the thing that they value the most and that can be the most reputation enhancing for them. And so I think having researchers emphasize the importance of these scholarly outputs to their future reputation, to being able to reliably cite something on a CV, on a tenure application, I feel like this is something that can be really effective in speaking to our administrators about the value of investing in preservation for these types of outputs. So it's always still a challenge, I think, as a library to help people look towards the next thing. And as you said, it is often an issue of until things break or they don't work or there's not enough space or things like that. It can be more difficult, but I think really engaging with our research communities and letting them know about some of these issues and having them speak out about the impacts that this lack of preservation might have on their futures would be really helpful.
That's an
Yeah.
excellent point. Excellent point. I wish we could take like a hologram version of you with us into these meetings, but that's very good insight for us to take forward. A question from the chat from Carolyn Coates. Wonder if the focus on preprints solves one, costs of commercial publishing, but throws the idea of peer review under the bus. What about the value of editorial work? Apologies for my own warping of that, but hopefully the question comes through.
Yeah, no problem. I'll take this one, and I'll be very brief because I don't want to go over time, and I want to give time to our fellow presenters for the next session. The short version is, I think that the expansion, I wouldn't say refocus, but the expansion into preprint preservation is not a value judgment on the value of peer-reviewed research. It is just a recognition that in order for scholarship of today to be understandable in 10, 50, 150 years, we will need to also have these side artifacts and preprints, and the value of which we can discuss sort of on a philosophical level differently. So it's not a switch to preprints, it is an expansion of the scope to also include preprints.
Yeah, and there's I'll just reply to Wendy Robertson's comment in the chat. I know LOCKSS preserves the whole look and feel, but thinking about other preservation methods, I am concerned about the metadata connecting versions of the preprint, connecting to the article, and connecting to retraction or non-publication, and also any peer reviews of the preprint. All of this, especially in medicine. Yes, this is something where the preprints and the proliferation of communication of nascent and emergent knowledge through preprints is aligning and coinciding with the rise of misinformation and disinformation, and a decline in trust in what used to be authoritative institutions, medicine, scholarly publishing, a distrust of the academy and of intellectual enterprise. So the two pursuits of preservation and a correctable or a responsibility to preserving the best or the most accurate version of information online, those things might seem to be at odds, but they are very closely related, and it points to what Rochelle was speaking about with the lack of standards and the inability to sort of declare a standard model for preprint publication that has a persistent identifier that allows for the designation of subsequent versions or snapshots of an edited document in time. Indeed, at SSP this year, there was a presentation from a publisher that is moving towards a no firm decision, no yes or no decision. And they don't have a specific plan for connecting to a peer-reviewed version of a preprint version. So just connecting the dots in that fashion would be a valuable addition, and being able to say, this is the draft, these are the comments, and this is how the finished scholarship turned up. This is, Latour and Woolgar, science in action, right? This is the creation of science and medicine, as Wendy Robertson points out. This is particularly interesting in certain fields, but really throughout scholarly communication. Being able to connect those dots and show the making of the sausage is going to be potentially a valuable part of this process, preserving that evolutionary record.
And going back to transparency, which was a great point that
Exactly.
you all raised earlier. Yeah, wonderful.
Precisely. And if there's a retraction, how do we link that to every version of the work as it has proliferated? How do we make sure that wherever it shows up, it's the web is a single point of access when it wants to be, but it is also a whack-a-mole when it wants to be too.
I feel like we could have a whole conference on retractions, just the topic.
Yes.
But thank you so much again for your insights, for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate all of the great things you've given us to digest. We're going to take a brief break. Our next session will begin at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. So we're going to transition over to our next presentation. But thank you again so much for being a part of NASIG Autumn.
Thank you.
Thank you.